In May of 1945, the fighting stopped, but there were still thousands of German tanks spread all over Europe. Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs were left sitting along highways, in wooded areas, and beside wrecked factories. The Allied armies were left with a straightforward problem to solve. What should be done with Hitler's armored vehicles? By the time Germany gave up on May 8, 1945, its tank force was only a fraction of what it had once been earlier in the war. After months of running out of fuel, factories being bombed, and non-stop retreats, hundreds of armored vehicles had been left behind across the country. In places like the Ruhr, Bavaria, and the area around Berlin, Allied troops came across Panthers and Panzer IVs that had been abandoned, often drained of fuel or missing parts that had been taken to keep other tanks moving. In many cases, German crews had intentionally disabled their own machines by wrecking engines or transmissions before giving up. Allied forces moved quickly to secure what they found. In the American occupation zone, U.S. technical intelligence teams documented vehicles at locations such as Oberjärsel and Galdorf. British Ream units carried out similar work at Hillersleben and Zenelager, while Soviet trophy brigades gathered armored vehicles throughout Silesia and into Berlin. The tanks that survived the war were in very different states of repair. Some vehicles were mostly complete but no longer dependable because key parts were worn out. Others had been picked clean of radios, optics, or engines, leaving little more than empty hulls. Prototype vehicles and newly built hulls were often missing major systems since bombing and shortages had interrupted production. Records discovered in repair shops allowed Allied analysts to track how tanks had been used during the war, though many files had been destroyed in the final weeks of fighting. By the summer of 1945, most remaining German tanks were parked in Allied-controlled depots, waiting to be studied, shipped elsewhere, or broken up for scrap. As occupation zones were fully organized in mid-1945, the focus shifted away from collecting tanks and toward evaluating them in detail. The United States and Britain wanted to learn how German tanks were built, what made them effective in battle, and where their flaws were. To do that, selected vehicles were either sent overseas or tested at proving grounds around Europe. For the United States, this work centered on Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Starting in late 1945, the U.S. Army transported Panthers, Tiger IVs, Tiger IIs, Jagdpanthers, and several assault guns to the site. Engineers ran firing trials, mechanical endurance tests, and armor penetration experiments. The findings showed a consistent trend: powerful guns and excellent optics paired with serious problems in final drives and transmissions. The British carried out their own investigations, though most of their testing stayed within Germany. British specialists compared the Panther's sloped armor and long gun to the designs of the Sherman and Churchill. They also reported that German optical equipment was extremely well made. At the same time, maintenance teams documented how hard German tanks were to repair and maintain under battlefield conditions. While British conclusions shaped early Cold War thinking, they did not result in Britain building tanks based on German designs. The Soviet Union handled captured armor in a different way. Soviet trophy brigades gathered large numbers of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Stugs, mainly to use them for training. Testing backed up what Soviet forces had already seen during the war: strong frontal armor and fast, hard-hitting guns, but mechanical systems that wore down quickly in tough conditions. By the early 1950s, most German tanks held by the Soviets were scrapped once replacement parts were no longer available. Some of the most valuable findings came from former research and testing centers. At Kummersdorf and Hillersleben, Allied teams uncovered unfinished hulls and experimental vehicles, including components tied to the Maus project and parts of the planned E-series. At Hauchtenbeck, repair shops contained damaged Jagdtigers, Panthers waiting for work, and stacks of spare parts, showing how far late-war engineering had gone without ever reaching full production. Early occupation orders required every German armored vehicle to be reported, secured, and kept from unauthorized use. This led Allied planners to argue over what should be done with the tanks: whether they should be saved for study, handed over to other countries, or destroyed to make sure Germany could not rearm. Each Allied power took its own approach. The United States focused mainly on testing. The Soviets gathered large numbers first and decided later what to do with them, and Britain, short on manpower and transport, examined fewer tanks where they were found. Despite these differences, Allied reports reached much the same conclusions. German tanks combined strong guns and advanced optics with designs that demanded heavy maintenance. These findings influenced early Cold War tank development. Designers showed interest in sloped armor and better optics, while also recognizing the importance of simpler, more reliable vehicles. After testing programs wrapped up, the Allies were still left with massive amounts of armored vehicles, spare parts, and unfinished prototypes. Between 1946 and 1948, the Allied Control Council issued several orders calling for the organized destruction of German military equipment. Tanks, armored hulls, and vehicle parts were labeled as raw materials, meaning they could not stay in German possession or be used for any future military buildup. This sparked widespread demilitarization across the former Reich. Scrapping operations focused heavily on industrial regions like the Ruhr, Saxony, and Thuringia. Steel mills in Bochum, Essen, and Magdeburg received long trains loaded with armored hulls, many shipped in from nearby storage sites. Workers used cutting torches and heavy equipment to slice Panthers, Panzer vehicles, and Stugs into scrap. Because post-war Germany faced a severe steel shortage, this recycling effort played a key role in rebuilding, with the recovered metal going straight into bridges, factories, and homes. By late 1947, hundreds of armored vehicles had been melted down, leaving almost no visible sign of their wartime use. Not every tank ended up in a steel mill. In rural areas, Allied engineers sometimes reused abandoned German armor for environmental or construction work. One well-known case took place along the Enns River in Austria, where Panthers and other vehicles were bulldozed into embankments to reinforce riverbanks. Similar methods were used in quarries across Central Europe, where tanks were buried as fill in areas prone to landslides. Over the years, dirt and plants covered these machines, blending them into the surrounding terrain. Another large portion of surviving German armor was turned into target vehicles. The British used tanks at ranges such as Lulworth, the Americans at Grafenwöhr and Aberdeen, and the Soviets at multiple training grounds. These hulks were used to test new ammunition, train gunners, and study the performance of new weapons. Once the tanks were badly damaged, they were either left where they sat or cut up for scrap. Cleanup efforts also continued in areas heavily damaged during the war, where vehicles had been abandoned in the final months. Teams in Czechoslovakia and Poland cleared wrecks from roads, forests, and former defensive positions, sending them to scrapyards or using them in land restoration projects. Former research and testing facilities were also stripped down. Unfinished prototypes, including parts of the Maus project, E-series hulls, and experimental chassis, were taken apart. The sheer scale of this effort meant that very few German tanks survived intact. Stories sometimes spread about secret bunkers packed with Panthers or hidden warehouses holding untouched Tigers, but the evidence points instead to misidentified buildings or Cold War-era rumors. By 1948, most German armored vehicles from the war had been destroyed, with only a small number kept for testing or transferred abroad. The tank force that once dominated Europe had been taken apart piece by piece. Even so, not every German tank was scrapped. A smaller but important number ended up serving with foreign armies rebuilding after the war. These vehicles helped countries that lacked modern armor or needed equipment fast. Their continued use gave German designs an unexpected afterlife, with some staying in service into the 1950s and even the 1960s. France became one of the earliest and largest users of these tanks. French forces gathered Panthers from depots in southwestern Germany and put them into service with the 503rd Combat Tank Regiment. Crews valued the Panthers for their strong firepower and high-quality optics, which were better than many Allied tanks available at the time. Problems with upkeep showed up fast. Spare parts were scarce and the drivetrains were already worn out, so French repair shops often had to strip several tanks just to keep one operating. Reports from the early 1950s talked about constant transmission trouble, and by 1951 France pulled the last Panthers out of service because the maintenance costs kept climbing. Even so, those tanks left a mark on French armored thinking while the country was rebuilding its military strength. Czechoslovakia had a special position since it had been a major producer of German armor during the war. After 1945, factories there kept producing the Hetzer G13, which was based on the Panzer 38 chassis. Many of these vehicles were sold to Switzerland, which continued using them well into the Cold War. Their simple design and dependable engines made the Hetzer a good fit for countries looking for affordable tank destroyers. Czechoslovakia also operated leftover Panzer IVs and Stugs before slowly replacing them with Soviet-built vehicles. Across Eastern Europe, countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia ended up with German armor either captured during the war or redistributed afterward. Romania used several Panzer IVs mainly for training, while Bulgaria added a mix of Panzer IVs and Stugs to its early post-war armored units. By the mid-1950s, most of these countries had fully switched over to Soviet-supplied T-34s and newer armored vehicles. Spain also became a small but notable post-war user of German tanks. In late 1943, Germany had delivered 20 Panzer IVs and 10 Stug assault guns to Franco's government. The Panzer IV stayed Spain's most important tank into the mid-1950s, serving alongside older Panzer I models. As maintenance became harder and parts ran out, Spain's fleet shrank, and in 1967 the country sold 17 remaining Panzer IVs to Syria. One of the most surprising post-war users turned out to be Syria. During the 1950s and 1960s, Syria acquired Panzer IVs from both Czechoslovakia and Spain and deployed them with frontline units along the Golan Heights. These tanks stayed in service into the 1970s, making them some of the last German World War II tanks ever used in combat roles. Their continued use shows how surplus armor spread around the world during the early Cold War, as countries searched for low-cost equipment while regional tensions grew. A lack of spare parts ultimately decided the fate of these fleets. Countries depended on captured stockpiles, local production, or improvised fixes. Mechanics often made parts themselves or mixed components from several tanks, and missing manuals made training crews more difficult. Even with these problems, the tanks still shaped early Cold War military thinking. By the middle of the 1950s, most nations had retired their German vehicles. Larger armies moved toward standardized equipment supplied by either the United States or the Soviet Union. At the same time, surviving Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs were placed in museums or turned into memorials. Places like the Tank Museum at Bovington, the Musée des Blindes in Samar, and the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow kept important examples, making sure these machines were not lost completely. If you found this video useful, take a look at what happened to German U-boats after World War II next, which explores how the U-boat fleet was captured, examined, and scattered around the world after the war. If you like exploring history beyond the textbook, subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more ahead.